The fluorescent lights in the classroom hummed a low, steady tune, a sound that had become the background music to her life. It was a monotonous buzz, and it matched the feeling that had settled deep in her bones. She stood at the front of the room, a dry erase marker in her hand, and looked out at the sea of young faces. Or rather, she looked out at the tops of their heads. Most of them were hunched over their desks, their attention anywhere but on the whiteboard where she had carefully drawn a series of fractions. She tried again, her voice a little brighter than she felt. "Okay, so if we have one whole pizza and we cut it into 4 equal slices, what do we call one of those slices?" She paused, scanning the room for a flicker of recognition. A single raised hand, nothing. The only movement was the slow, deliberate tapping of a pencil from the third row. A boy with sharp, knowing eyes and a mind that moved too fast for her lessons. He wasn't looking at the board. He was drawing intricate geometric shapes in the margin of his notebook, his pencil creating a rhythm that was more interesting than anything she had to say. The silence in the room wasn't a peaceful, thinking silence. It was heavy, thick, and suffocating. It was the silence of disconnect. She could feel the space between herself and the children widening like a chasm she had no idea how to cross. She used to be able to cross it. She remembered, years ago, feeling like a conductor, and her classroom was an orchestra. She could raise her hand, and they would lean in, their eyes bright with curiosity. A question could spark a dozen more, and the room would fill with the wonderful, chaotic energy of learning. Now, she felt like she was trying to conduct an orchestra where no one had brought their instruments. The only sound was the hum of the lights and the tapping of that pencil. Her mind drifted back to the meeting with the principal a few months ago. He was a kind man with a gentle face and a voice that never rose above a calm, measured tone. That was almost worse. If he had yelled, she could have been defensive. If he had been cruel, she could have dismissed it. But his kindness had been a mirror, reflecting back at her the very thing she was trying so hard to deny. "We need to see more engagement, Eleanor," he had said, leaning forward in his big leather chair. He didn't say, "You're failing," but she heard it all the same. He had shuffled some papers on his desk, a nervous habit that made her feel even more sorry for him, for having to have this conversation with her. The test scores are one thing, but it's the spark. It seems to be gone. The kids are quiet, yes, but they aren't with you. They're just waiting for what? She had thought. Waiting for the bell? Waiting for a real teacher? The words echoed in her head every day as she stood before them. She felt like a fraud, a woman playing dress-up in a teacher's clothes, pretending she knew what she was doing. Each lesson plan she wrote felt like a work of fiction. Each morning she picked out an outfit, she felt like she was putting on a costume. And the moment she stepped into the school, the performance began. But it was a bad play, and the audience, her fourth graders, knew it. They were just too polite or too bored to walk out. The bell finally rang, a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the heavy silence. The children came alive in an instant, a flurry of zippers and backpacks and chatter. They moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture, a desk, or a chair that was always in the same spot. The boy with the sharp eyes was one of the first out the door, disappearing into the noisy hallway without a backward glance. She watched him go, a familiar ache settling in her chest. He was so smart. She could see it in the way he solved problems when he finally decided to try, in the complex worlds he created in his notebooks. But she couldn't reach him. She couldn't make him care about long division or the proper use of a comma. And that, she thought, was the ultimate proof of her uselessness. A good teacher could make anything interesting. She couldn't even make fractions interesting. She stayed in the empty classroom for a long time after the last child had gone. The hum of the lights seemed to get louder in the quiet. She slowly erased the fractions from the whiteboard, the marker squeaking a protest with each swipe. The circular motions were almost hypnotic. Wipe away the lesson. Wipe away the failure. Start fresh tomorrow? But she knew it was a lie. Tomorrow would be the same. The same faces, the same silence, the same heavy feeling of not being enough. Finally, she gathered her things, her bag feeling heavier than it should. The drive home was a blur of gray streets and red taillights. She never turned on the radio anymore. The cheerful voices of DJs and the upbeat pop songs felt like an insult to the quiet sadness that sat in the passenger seat beside her. The world outside her car window seemed to be moving on, people heading home to families, to dinners, to lives that had meaning and purpose. And she was just driving back to an empty house, to a silence that was even louder than the one in her classroom. Her house was a small, neat place, a reflection of the order she tried to bring to her life. But now the neatness felt cold and sterile. The cushions on the sofa were perfectly plumped. The magazines on the coffee table were arranged in a neat fan. There was no life here, no mess, no joy. She dropped her bag by the door, the thud echoing in the stillness. She didn't bother to turn on the main lights, instead navigating through the gloom to the kitchen, where she opened the refrigerator and stared blankly at its contents. A carton of milk, a few lonely-looking vegetables, a container of leftovers from a meal she hadn't had the appetite to finish. She wasn't hungry. She was just empty. She ended up in her living room, sinking into her favorite armchair. The fabric was worn and soft, molded to the shape of her body over years of evenings just like this. She looked around the room, at the pictures on the walls, at the books on the shelves. It was all evidence of a life lived, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. A woman who used to laugh, who used to have hobbies, who used to believe she could make a difference. That woman felt like a distant memory, a character in a book she had read a long time ago. All that was left was this tired, hollow feeling and the quiet, unshakable thought that she had nothing left to give, to her students, to herself, to anyone. She was just a placeholder, a ghost in her own life, waiting for something, anything to change. The silence in the house was a living thing. It pressed in on her from all sides, a heavy, blank weight that was somehow louder than any noise. She sat in the worn armchair, the fabric cool against her skin, and stared into the middle distance. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was a sharp, cruel sound, each tick a hammer blow against the quiet, each talk a reminder that another second of her life had passed, just as empty as the last. She couldn't take it anymore. This feeling of being a ghost in her own home, a spectator to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, was suffocating her. She had to do something. Anything. With a sudden burst of energy that startled her, she pushed herself out of the chair. The movement was clumsy, almost angry. She stood for a moment, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heart beating a little faster. What could she do? Read a book? The words would just swim on the page, meaningless black squiggles. Watch television? The bright, cheerful faces of actors living scripted. Happy lives would feel like a personal insult. No, she needed to do something real, something physical. She needed to move. Her eyes landed on a small, almost invisible smudge on the coffee table. That was it. That was something she could fix. She marched into the kitchen, her steps purposeful, and pulled a clean cloth from a drawer. She wetted under the tap, the sound of the running water a strange comfort. Wringing it out, she returned to the living room and began to scrub at the smudge. It came away easily. She scrubbed it a little more, polishing the surface until it gleamed under the dim lamplight. Then she moved to the bookshelf, dusting the spines of books she hadn't opened in years. She wiped down the picture frames, her fingers briefly tracing the smiling faces of people she felt she no longer knew. This was good. This was control. For every speck of dust she removed, for every surface she polished to a shine, she was imposing a small bit of order on a world that felt completely chaotic. She worked her way around the room, her movements becoming more fluid, more rhythmic. She was no longer just a woman sitting in a chair. She was a doer, an actor. The frantic energy inside her had found an outlet. She was cleaning not just her house, but the feeling of failure out of her soul. As she worked, her gaze kept being drawn to one particular spot in the room. It was the corner, the one behind the reading lamp, a space that was always in shadow. There, huddled and forgotten, stood a large, bulky shape draped in a white sheet. It was her grandmother's old upright piano. She hadn't looked at it directly in years. It was just part of the furniture, a silent monument to a part of her life she had carefully packed away. It represented a different version of herself, a younger woman who laughed easily, who felt things deeply, who had dreams that didn't involve lesson plans and performance reviews. She tried to ignore it, to focus on wiping down the windowsills, but her eyes kept drifting back. The white sheet looked like a shroud. It was a ghost in the corner, a ghost of her own past. The more she looked at it, the more it seemed to call to her. The frantic energy of her cleaning slowed, replaced by a different kind of feeling, a pull of curiosity and something else, something she couldn't quite name. Finally, she stood before it. The sheet was yellowed with age, and a fine layer of dust lay on its top surface. She could see the vague, lumpy shape of the piano underneath. She remembered the feel of the keys, the weight of the pedals under her feet. She remembered the sound of her grandmother's voice encouraging her, her hands gently guiding hers over the ivories. "Let the music tell its own story," she used to say. But that was a long time ago. The story had ended, or had it? A strange, reckless thought popped into her head. A thought that was so out of character, so unlike the controlled, cautious woman she had become. Why not? What was she afraid of? That she'd be bad at it? She already felt bad at everything else. That it would sound terrible? The silence already sounded terrible. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched the edge of the sheet. The fabric was rough and cool. She took a deep breath, the air catching in her throat. And then with a single, decisive motion she pulled. The sheet came away in a cloud of dust. The air filled with a million tiny, dancing particles, all glittering in the lamplight like a sudden magical snowstorm. She took a step back, coughing slightly, and waved a hand in front of her face. As the dust settled, the piano was revealed. It was more beautiful than she remembered, and more worn. The wood was a deep, warm brown, but it was covered in scratches and nicks, each one a memory. There was a faded watermark ring on the top, a relic from a forgotten glass of lemonade. The keys were a creamy yellow, no longer pure white, and some of them had slight hairline cracks like old porcelain. It wasn't a perfect, pristine instrument. It was a lived-in one. It was real. She slowly circled it, running her hand lightly over the smooth, cool wood. She felt the history in it, the echoes of countless songs played in this very room. She opened the small lid that covered the keys, the hinges groaning in protest. The sight of the 88 keys waiting patiently sent a jolt through her. They looked like a long, quiet road, stretching out into a part of her she hadn't visited in a very long time. She pulled out the worn wooden bench and sat down. It creaked under her weight, a familiar, comforting sound. She adjusted her position, her body falling into a posture she thought she had forgotten. Her hands hovered over the keys just an inch above them. They felt heavy and awkward. Her fingers, which used to dance and fly, now felt stiff and foreign. She was scared. Scared that the magic was gone, that she had lost it for good. Scared that touching the keys would only confirm what she already suspected, that the best parts of her were dead and buried. She closed her eyes. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick. She could hear the clock ticking, but it sounded different now, less like a hammer blow and more like a steady, waiting heartbeat. She thought of the silence in her classroom, the heavy, suffocating silence. She thought of the silence in her house, the empty, aching silence. She was so tired of silence. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her right hand. Her index finger found a key in the middle of the keyboard. It was smooth and cool, and it fit perfectly under her fingertip. She hesitated for just a moment, a lifetime of doubt and fear holding her back. Then, with a breath she didn't realize she was holding, she pressed down. The note that came out was not loud or dramatic. It was a single, clear, perfect C, but in the context of the heavy silence, it was like a thunderclap. The sound seemed to bloom in the air, a pure, resonant tone that filled every corner of the room. It was a clean, honest sound, full and rich. It vibrated through the piano, through the floor, up the bench, and into her bones. She held her finger down, letting the note hang in the air, a single, shining thread of sound weaving through the quiet, And then, as the sound began to fade, she lifted her finger. The silence returned, but it was a different silence. It was no longer empty or heavy. It was a listening silence, a waiting silence. It was filled with the memory of the note. It was a silence that held the promise of another. She sat there, her hand still resting on the keys, a strange new feeling beginning to stir inside her. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something smaller, but just as powerful. It was a flicker, a tiny, fragile spark of life in a room that had been dark for far too long. The silence that followed the fading note was not the same silence that had filled the room before. It was no longer a heavy, empty blanket. It was a quiet space, waiting, listening. She kept her finger on the key, feeling the last tiny vibration die away under her touch. A single note. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a door had been cracked open in a room that had been sealed shut for years. She sat there for a long time, her hand resting on the keys, just breathing. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick of the clock in the hall, they were still there, but they no longer sounded like a countdown. They were just sounds, part of the quiet rhythm of the house. Her curiosity, a feeling she thought had long since withered away, began to stir. What would another note sound like? She lifted her hand and, with a little more confidence this time, pressed the white key right next to it. A D clear and true. Then the next one. An E. She played them slowly, one by one, listening to the way each sound rang out and then gently faded. It was like learning to speak again, syllable by syllable. She found a black key and pressed it. The sound was sharper, different. It was a question. The white keys were statements. She was starting to remember their language. That first night, she didn't try to play a song. She just explored. She ran her fingers up the keyboard in a slow, clumsy scale, the notes stumbling over each other like shy children. Her fingers, which for years had only known the shape of a pen or a piece of chalk, felt stiff and awkward. They didn't want to bend in the right ways. But she was patient. There was no one here to judge her. No principal to give her a performance review. No students to stare with blank faces. It was just her and the 88 keys, and they seemed to be telling her that it was okay to be a beginner. This became her secret ritual. Every evening, after the dinner dishes were washed and the lesson plans for the next day were laid out on the table like a corpse, she would turn off all the lights in the house except for a small lamp beside the piano. The world outside would go to sleep, but her world would just be waking up. She would sit on the creaky bench, the dusty, woody smell of the old instrument filling her senses, and she would play. At first, it was not pretty. Her hands would fumble, striking two keys at once. Her timing was off, creating lopsided, awkward rhythms. She would try to remember a simple song from her childhood, but the notes would get jumbled in her mind, and her fingers would refuse to cooperate. There were moments of frustration, moments when she would slam her hands down on the keys in a discordant crash of anger. But the anger was different from the frustration she felt at school. At school, the anger was turned inward, a hot, sharp feeling of her own inadequacy. Here, the anger was just sound. She could play it, hear it, and then let it go. The piano didn't care. It would absorb her frustration and be ready for the next note. She started with the basics, just as her grandmother had taught her all those years ago. Simple scales, up and down, until her fingers began to remember the patterns. It was like training a muscle that had gone weak. At first, her wrists would ache and her fingers would feel sore. But slowly, day by day, a little bit of strength returned. A little bit of memory, not just in her mind, but in her hands themselves. Then, she found a book of old, yellowed sheet music inside the piano bench. It was a collection of simple waltzes, the kind her grandmother used to love. She pulled one out, the paper brittle and fragrant. The notes on the page looked like a foreign language, a secret code she had forgotten how to read. But she stared at it, and slowly, pieces began to come back to her. This symbol meant sharp. This one meant play it a little faster. She started with the right hand alone, playing the melody one note at a time. It was agonizingly slow. She would spend a whole evening just trying to master a single measure. Her brow furrowed in concentration. But then, one night, something magical happened. She had been struggling with a particular phrase, a little run of notes that always tripped her up. She had played it over and over, getting it wrong each time. She was about to give up, her shoulders slumping in defeat. But then, she took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and just played it without thinking. And it came out, smooth and fluid like water flowing over stones. Her fingers had remembered what her mind had forgotten. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. A wide, genuine smile spread across her face, the first real, unforced smile she had felt in months. She played the phrase again, just to make sure it wasn't a fluke. It was perfect. In that moment, she wasn't a failing teacher or a lonely woman. She was a musician. This nocturnal ritual began to change her in small, almost invisible ways. The tension that she carried in her shoulders, a tight knot of stress and anxiety, began to loosen. The perpetual frown line between her eyebrows started to soften. She found herself humming little snatches of the waltz as she made her breakfast in the morning. The drive to school was still quiet, but the silence in the car felt less like a void and more like a peaceful pause. The students noticed the change, even if they couldn't put their finger on it. The heavy, oppressive air in her classroom began to thin, just a little. Her voice, when she spoke, had a softer, more patient quality. One afternoon, when a child spilled a box of crayons, she didn't sigh with irritation. She simply knelt down and started helping to pick them up, a small, kind smile on her lips. The children looked at her, surprised. The boy with the sharp eyes and the fast-moving mind, the one who was always drawing in his notebook, watched her for a moment longer than usual before turning back to his geometric shapes. She never told anyone about her late-night sessions. It was her secret world, a private language she was learning to speak again. The piano was her confidant, the one place where she didn't have to be the teacher. She could be frustrated, joyful, sad, or tired, and the music would hold it all without judgment. She was still the same woman, still living the same life, but something fundamental had shifted. She had found a small, quiet room inside herself that was filled not with silence or doubt, but with the clear, resonant sound of music. And in that sound, she was beginning to find herself again. The morning light slanted through the classroom windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, silent stars. She stood at the whiteboard, the dry erase marker feeling cold and unfamiliar in her hand. On the board, she had drawn a series of circles and squares, all divided into different numbers of pieces. She was trying to explain equivalent fractions, a concept that always felt like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. It was there, you could see it, but it was hard to hold on to. "Okay, everyone," she began, her voice softer than it used to be, but still holding a hint of the old anxiety. "Look at this circle. It's cut into 2 pieces, and this one is cut into 4. If I shade in 1 piece of the first circle and 2 pieces of the second, the amount shaded is the same. They are equivalent." She looked out at the faces staring back at her. They were polite, quiet, but their eyes were glazed over. She was losing them again? The familiar knot of dread began to tighten in her stomach. She could see him, the boy with the sharp eyes and the mind that raced ahead of her lessons. He wasn't even pretending to look at the board. His head was bent over his notebook, his pencil moving in a swift, sure rhythm. He wasn't doodling today. He was building something. An intricate castle with towers and turrets, a world so much more interesting than fractions. She felt a pang of the old frustration, the feeling of being a boring, irrelevant voice in the corner of their vibrant inner worlds. She was about to sigh, about to erase the board and try again with a different, probably equally useless explanation, but then something different happened. As she opened her mouth to speak, she didn't see the fractions on the board. In her mind's eye, she saw something else entirely. She saw the black and white keys of her grandmother's piano. She saw the sheet music for the waltz she had been struggling with, the notes filled with flags and dots that changed their value. A whole note held for 4 beats. A half note held for 2. 2 half notes took the same amount of time as 1 whole note. 4 quarter notes took the same time as 2 half notes. They were equivalent. The thought struck her like a bolt of lightning, so sudden and clear it almost made her gasp. It was the same concept. The exact same idea, just expressed in a different language. The language of time, of rhythm, of sound. It was a language she had been fluent in every night for weeks. A language that felt more natural to her now than the language of lesson plans and state standards. A wild, reckless idea took root. It was the same feeling she had when she ripped the sheet off the piano. A feeling of, what do I have to lose? Her heart started to beat a little faster. This was either going to be a moment of brilliant inspiration or a spectacular, confusing failure. But anything was better than the slow, quiet death of another failed lesson. "All right," she said, her voice sounding different even to her own ears. It was firmer, more present. "Forget the circles for a minute. Everyone, just listen for a second." The children looked up, surprised by the change in her tone. Even the boy with the sharp eyes paused his drawing. His curiosity piqued. In the corner of the room, gathering dust, was a small electronic keyboard. She had brought it in months ago, intending to use it for a lesson about sound waves that never happened. It had just become another piece of classroom furniture, ignored and forgotten. Now she walked over to it, her step sure and purposeful. She picked it up, the plastic casing cool against her hands, and placed it on her desk at the front of the room. The students watched, a murmur of interest rippling through the room. This was not in the lesson plan. She plugged it in, the small power light glowing a steady red. She sat on her stool, her back straight, her hands hovering over the keys. For a moment she felt a flicker of stage fright. What if she messed up? What if this was a terrible idea? But then she looked at the boy, who was now watching her with his full, undivided attention. His sharp eyes were narrowed, not in boredom, but in concentration. He was trying to figure out what she was going to do. She took a breath and pressed a key. A clear, simple C note filled the silent room. She held her finger down, letting the sound hang in the air. "That," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "is a whole note? It gets one whole beat." She lifted her finger. Then she pressed 2 keys in succession, 2 notes that took up the same amount of time as the first one. "And that," she continued, "was 2 half notes. They each get half a beat." She played them again. 2 halves. They take up the same amount of time as one whole. They are equivalent. The room was silent. The children were leaning forward in their seats. She had their full attention. Every single one of them. She played 4 quick notes. And those are quarter notes. 4 of them fit into the same space as that one whole note. She looked back at the board, at the divided circles and squares. It's the same thing. 1 whole is the same as 2 halves, which is the same as 4 quarters. It's just a different way of dividing up the same amount of time. She looked back at the class. The abstract concept was no longer a shape on a board. It was a sound they could all hear and feel. A hand shot up. It was him, the boy with the sharp eyes. For the first time all year, his hand was up, not to ask to go to the bathroom, but to answer a question. She nodded at him, her heart soaring. "So," he said, his voice clear and confident, a dotted half note. "That's like 3 quarters, right? Because the dot adds half the value of the note." She stared at him, stunned. He hadn't just understood the analogy. He had extended it. He had taken the language of music and applied it to the math, and then asked a more complex question. He was thinking. He was engaged. "Yes," she said, a wide, genuine smile spreading across her face. "Yes, exactly. It's 3 quarters." The lesson that followed was unlike any she had ever taught. It became a symphony of mathematical relationships. They clapped out rhythms to understand multiplication tables. They used the structure of a musical phrase to learn about paragraphs in writing. The keyboard became a bridge, connecting her world to theirs, connecting the abstract to the real, connecting sound to understanding. The bell rang and nobody moved. They were too busy arguing in a friendly way about whether a complex rhythm was more like a 6th or an 8th dot as the students finally gathered their things. The boy lingered for a moment by her desk. He didn't say anything about math. He just pointed at the keyboard. My dad plays the guitar, he said quietly. He says music is just math you can feel. She looked at the sharp, intelligent boy who she had thought was lost to her, and she felt a wave of warmth wash over her. Your dad is a very smart man, she said. He shrugged, a small smile on his face, and then he was gone. She sat at her desk for a long time after the room was empty. The hum of the lights no longer a sound of failure, but a quiet hum of possibility. She hadn't just taught a lesson that day. She had finally learned one herself. She wasn't useless. She had just been speaking the wrong language, and now she had found the words. The months that followed were like a slow, quiet spring. The change in her classroom didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't a sudden, magical transformation. It was more like a garden that had been dormant for a long time, slowly coming back to life. The small keyboard on her desk was no longer a novelty. It was just another tool, like the whiteboard or the textbooks. Some days they used it, and some days they didn't. But the rhythm, the idea that learning could have a beat and a flow, had seeped into the very walls of the room. Their lessons on history became different. When they learned about the pioneers, they didn't just read about them in a book. They listened to the simple, haunting folk songs of the time, songs about struggle and hope. She asked them to think about what the music told them about the people's lives, what the lyrics said that a textbook couldn't. When they studied poetry, they didn't just analyze the rhyme scheme. They clapped out the meter, feeling the iambic pentameter in their hands, understanding that a poem, like a song, was built on a foundation of rhythm. The classroom wasn't an orchestra of perfectly tuned instruments, but it was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of chatter, of debate, of kids trying to figure things out together. The boy with the sharp eyes became a different kind of leader. He was still quiet, still preferred the world of his own notebook, but he was no longer an island. One afternoon, during a group project about building bridges out of popsicle sticks, his group was stuck. Their design kept collapsing. He watched them struggle for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then he walked over to the keyboard. He didn't play a song. He just tapped out a simple, steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's the pattern, he said, without looking at them. You're putting the big sticks on the weak beats. You need to strengthen the foundation. Like the bass line in a song. The other kids looked at him, a little confused, but then they saw it. They saw the pattern in his tapping and the pattern in their failing bridge. They started again, this time following his rhythmic advice. Their bridge, when they finished, was the strongest in the class. He didn't take the credit. He just went back to his desk and added a new drawing to his notebook, a bridge, with musical notes flying over it like birds. One afternoon, there was a quiet knock on her classroom door. It was the principal. He smiled his gentle, calm smile. Mind if I observe for a bit? He asked. Her old self, the teacher from a year ago, would have felt a jolt of pure panic. Her heart would have started racing, and she would have instantly forgotten every single thing she was planning to do. But now she just smiled back. Of course, she said. Come on in. We're just trying to figure out how to persuade the city council to build a new park. The class was in the middle of a writing assignment. They had to write persuasive letters, and they were brainstorming arguments as a group. The room was a little noisy, a little chaotic, but it was a productive noise. She didn't lecture. She moved from group to group, listening, asking questions, nudging them in the right direction. She stopped at the group with the sharp-eyed boy. They were arguing about which was a more important point, that the park would give kids a place to play, or that it would make the neighborhood look nicer. Play is more important, one girl insisted, but looking nice makes people feel better. Another boy argued. The boy with the sharp eyes hadn't said anything. He was just listening. Then he looked up. It's like a song, he said quietly. Everyone stopped to listen to him. The words are the play part. They're the main message. But the melody, the way it sounds, that's the looking nice part. You need both. A song with great words but a terrible tune is annoying. A beautiful tune with stupid words is boring. You have to make them work together. The other kids stared at him, and then they all started nodding. The analogy was perfect. It was simple, and it made complete sense. She looked over at the principal. He was standing by the door, his arms crossed, a look of deep concentration on his face. He wasn't just watching the kids. He was listening to them. He was seeing the way they were thinking, the way they were connecting ideas. After the class, as the students were noisily packing up their bags, he walked over to her desk. "I'm not sure what you're doing here," he said, his voice thoughtful, "but it's remarkable. It's not just engagement. It's a different kind of thinking. They're creative. They're not just giving you the answers they think you want to hear. They're solving problems in ways I've never seen fourth graders solve them before." She felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't the glow of pride, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was on the right path. "I just helped them find their own music," she said softly, that evening. She didn't feel the usual exhaustion that had once been her constant companion. She felt a pleasant tiredness, the kind you feel after a long day of good, hard work. At home, after the dinner dishes were done, she walked over to the old upright piano in the corner. The sheet music for the waltz was still on the stand, but she didn't look at it. She didn't need to anymore. She knew the notes by heart, not just in her head but in her hands. She sat down on the worn bench and began to play. The music that filled the room was not perfect. There were still a few hesitant notes, a slightly mistimed chord here and there. But it didn't matter. The sound was rich and full and alive. It was the sound of her own story, a story with sad parts and frustrating parts, but a story that was, in the end, full of hope. She wasn't playing to escape her life anymore. She was playing to celebrate it. As her fingers danced over the keys, she thought about her journey. The piano hadn't made her a new person. It hadn't magically given her all the answers. It had simply helped her tune the instrument she had been all along. It had reminded her that she had a rhythm, a melody, a song of her own to sing, and in finding her own music again, she had finally been able to hear the beautiful, unique music inside each of her students. She realized that being a teacher wasn't about being the perfect conductor of a flawless orchestra. It was about creating a space where every instrument, no matter how quiet or out of tune, felt brave enough to play its own song. And as the final notes of the waltz faded into the quiet, happy hum of her home, she knew she was finally, truly listening.